Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. All the content I create is purely speculative and based on personal opinions. Not every nightmare begins with an explosion or a scream. Some nightmares are born from the very thing people trust most in this world, a sheet of paper signed by a doctor, a hospital seal. A few cold lines of conclusion powerful enough to make even the strongest woman collapse. Anita had lived inside that nightmare for months, day after day, as if she had been locked in a room with no windows, where the only light came from the belief that she was fighting to stay alive. But if that room had never truly existed, if the door had not been locked at all, but had only been part of an elaborate deception, then everything she had endured would become something even worse than suffering. It would become a humiliation so devastating that no medicine could ever mend it. And the most terrifying part was that the betrayal did not come from an obvious enemy. It came from the very system she had once believed was her last refuge: medicine, hospitals, the people in white coats with perfectly practiced expressions of understanding. Anita was not only exhausted by chemotherapy, she was exhausted because she had placed her trust in the wrong hands, and that trust had been crushed by someone ruthless, calculating, and patient. Like a predator savoring the slow collapse of its prey. 3 rounds of chemotherapy had stripped Anita of the things no one could fully see as long as she still had enough strength to put on makeup, enough strength to smile. Enough strength to preserve the image of a queen who never fell. It took her hair, her sleep, her appetite, and her sense of control over her own body, but what it distorted most was her mind. Anita had begun to hate the woman staring back at her in the mirror, to hate the eyes that always seemed to be begging for a miracle, to hate the body that betrayed her through every wave of nausea, every spell of numbness, every essay night spent wondering whether she would wake up too weak to even rise from bed. In her weakest moments, she forced herself to appear strongest, because if Anita ever admitted that she was afraid, all of Fairmont Crest would smell blood. She understood too well how the place worked. The moment a powerful person began to weaken, others would start circling, ready to replace, strip, and even celebrate the fall. So Anita was not fighting only to live, she was fighting to avoid being seen as someone already losing. In the process, she taught herself a cruel lesson. Pain had become something private, and trust had become a luxury. Vernon was the one closest to Anita, the one who had witnessed every time she gripped the sleeve of her hospital gown as if she were crossing a battlefield rather than a corridor. He tried to be her pillar, but the more he struggled to stay calm, the more he felt something inside himself being torn apart. He was a man who had lived through real wars, years in which trust could either save a community or destroy it. Yet in the face of his wife's illness, he was reduced to something painfully ordinary, a man who could only stand there and pray. A man who could do nothing but count the numbers on lab reports as though he were counting down a bomb. There were moments when Vernon felt anger so intense he did not know where to put it. Anger at Anita's body being ravaged, anger at the cold machinery of medicine, anger at himself for being able to do nothing except remain beside her. But he swallowed all of it, believing that this was the only way Anita could still have somewhere safe to lean. Vernon kept telling himself that if Anita was fighting cancer, then he would fight beside her. He could not imagine that there might be another enemy far more terrifying than cancer itself, an enemy disguised as a savior. Ashley entered that darkness like a fragile streak of light, not because she was naive, but because she had somehow managed to keep the ability to see a possible way forward even when others had already been suffocated by the dark. Ashley looked at Anita with a mixture of respect and sorrow, but beneath that was a growing frustration with the way the system worked, the procedures, the paperwork, the protocols, the vague answers, and the excessive, overly professional silence of certain people. From the very beginning, Ashley felt that something did not fit. It was not Anita's symptoms that troubled her most. It was the way everything had been arranged too smoothly, too conveniently, all driving toward one single conclusion: chemotherapy as quickly as possible, as aggressively as possible. as though someone were in a hurry to push Anita into a tunnel with no way back. Every time Ashley tried to ask questions, she was met with the same kind of look, the kind that said, "Do not make this difficult. Do not doubt us. We know what we are doing." Yet that confidence was exactly what made Ashley uneasy, because she understood one thing clearly. Confidence was the easiest thing in the world to fake when the person in front of you was terrified. Then Monica returned, and her return did not feel like a visit of concern. It felt like a violent tug that ripped the curtain down and exposed the harsh, frightening reality of what people had tried so hard to hide. Monica was not the kind of woman who carried gentle energy. She carried the energy of someone who had survived costly mistakes, someone who had witnessed too many tragedies to be soothed by respectable appearances. She arrived at the exact moment Anita was at her weakest, when Vernon was exhausted from always having to be the strong one, and when Ashley was trapped between instinct and caution. Monica did not come simply to comfort them. She came because a missing piece had fallen into her hands, something she could not ignore. In Monica's eyes, Anita's cancer was not merely bad news. It could be a weapon, and when Monica suspected something, she did not do it halfway. She retraced every thread, paying attention to the details others overlooked, where the sample had been sent, who had signed for it, when the results had been returned. The irregularities in the comparison records, the gaps in the file. Those small details, once laid side by side, formed a cold straight line leading toward the most horrifying possibility of all. Anita may never have had breast cancer at all. Before that moment, Anita's fear had at least possessed a clear shape, a tumor, a disease, an invisible but real enemy. But once Monica raised the possibility that the diagnosis had been manipulated, that fear transformed into something far more abstract, and therefore far more dangerous, a human being, a will. A mastermind capable of watching Anita suffer without flinching. The shock did not make Anita burst into tears. It turned her to stone. There are moments when people do not cry because they are too hurt, but because the pain has become too large to place anywhere that makes sense. Anita looked back on everything she had lived through as if she were watching a maliciously edited film. Every time she had gripped Vernon's hand and promised herself she would survive. Every time she had clutched the hospital bed through waves of nausea. Every time she had closed her eyes and endured it for needle as though submitting to some ritual sacrifice. If all of it had been false, then what exactly had she sacrificed? And to whom had she surrendered the power to do that to her? The anger rising inside Anita did not erupt into a scream. It burned low and vicious, making every cell in her body feel ready to split apart. This was not merely deception. It was punishment. It was humiliation. It was a slow, clean, legal form of attempted murder, one that could even be praised as treatment. Anita began to think of the enemies she had made over the years, the people who had bowed their heads before her while hatred simmered in their eyes. The family war she had once believed she had already won. She was not innocent in the world of power. She understood that it ran on debts, grudges, and consequences. But Anita had always believed her enemies would come for her through money, reputation, scandal, legal warfare, or the press. She had never imagined anyone would choose to strike at the most private part of her existence, her body. In that moment, her humiliation became as sharp as her rage. She was humiliated that others had seen her weak. Humiliated that she had opened the door and let them into her life because of a typed conclusion on a page. Humiliated that she had dragged Vernon into that hell beside her, forcing him to live inside her fear for what might have been no reason at all. Humiliated that those around her had pitied her, when pity was the thing Anita hated most. She felt like a symbol someone had deliberately shattered, not because they wanted her dead immediately, but because they wanted her to doubt herself, to unravel from the inside. When Vernon heard what Monica was suggesting, he did not react like a man who had simply been shocked. He reacted like a man whose deepest protective instinct had been struck with a blade. Two parallel forms of anger rose inside him. The first was aimed at whoever had forced him to watch his wife suffer while he stood helpless. The second was aimed at himself, because he had believed it. Vernon was not used to being deceived. He had stood at podiums, looked rivals straight in the eye, and learned how to recognize lies. Yet here, he had been defeated by technical language and the authority of a hospital seal. He felt as though he had been reduced to a weak husband who did nothing but nod along with other people's decisions. But inside that rage, he was also tortured by one vicious question: if the diagnosis were actually real, if they were wrong and the suspicion caused chaos, would they be hurting Anita even more? That conflict dragged him into directions at once. On one side was the instinct for revenge. On the other was the fear that one wrong move could truly kill Anita. And that made him hate the unseen enemy even more, because that enemy had forced them into a game where every possible choice was painful. Ashley, meanwhile, was consumed by a different kind of fury, the fury of someone young enough to still believe in right and wrong. She could not bear the thought that a hospital might become a battlefield for power games, that a medical file could be altered as casually as a contract. But Ashley also understood that if this was true, it was not just one person's crime. It was a network. No one could do something like this alone. No one could quietly change results and still allow the entire chemotherapy process to move forward so smoothly. Someone in the lab had to be involved. Someone with system access had to be involved. Someone had to be protecting it all, and the reason had to be large enough to keep multiple people silent. Ashley looked at Anita and saw a dangerous shift taking place. Anita no longer wanted only the truth, she wanted blood. Not necessarily blood in the literal sense, but the destruction of whoever had dared to play with her life. Ashley feared that kind of anger because it could push Anita toward choices from which there would be no return, the kind of choices a powerful person might make after being humiliated. When regaining control becomes more important than anything else. And Ashley feared something else too. If Anita were driven far enough into a corner, she would strike back so hard that she might wound herself in the process. Monica was not the kind of person who stirred panic and then disappeared. She laid out a path that was cold, practical, and mercilessly logical. There had to be an independent comparison test. The original biopsy had to be re-examined. The system logs had to be retrieved. And the chain of custody on the medical file had to be traced. But in Fairmont Crest, doing things the right way was its own challenge, because whoever stood behind this could easily have anticipated every proper step. Monica understood that a sophisticated conspiracy was not built only on physical tampering. It was built on fear, on making the victim too frightened to doubt anything at all. Whoever had orchestrated this had exploited reputation, urgency, the family's panic, and even Anita's public image as a brave woman fighting for her life, turning the entire story into something everyone wanted to believe. Monica saw a power game operating at the hospital level, a place where money and influence could buy silence, where a few signatures could push a woman into chemotherapy and no one would dare slow down long enough to verify the truth. And she saw the personal motive as well. Someone wanted Anita weakened, wanted her removed from the board, wanted Vernon disoriented, wanted the Dupree family fractured. It could have been someone who had hated Anita for years, someone who wanted her position, her power, her legacy. Or it could have been something even larger, a broader plot in which Anita was only the opening move, a test to see how this family would react when attacked at its most vulnerable point. Once Anita accepted that she might have been deliberately harmed, she began to change in a way that made her both frightening and heartbreaking. Frightening because she became sharper, colder, more calculating, and no longer cared whether anyone liked her. Heartbreaking because beneath that coldness was a woman who had been robbed of the right to suffer for a real reason. Anita had once accepted pain because she believed it meant something. Chemotherapy meant survival. Endurance meant hope. But if that pain had been meaningless, then it became something naked and monstrous, torture. Nothing drives a person toward madness faster than the realization that they were forced to suffer for someone else's cruel game. Anita began to remember every doctor's face, every professionally staged touch, every firm assurance that this was the best treatment plan. Those memories were no longer comfort. They were evidence, a suspect list, knives turning in her mind. She felt that she could no longer trust anyone except herself, yet even she became a source of doubt. Was she uncovering a conspiracy, or was she building one in her mind because she could not bear the possibility that she had truly been sick? That contradiction coiled around her heart like a snake, tightening and whispering that if she did not seize control now, she would be crushed. Vernon and Ashley, caught in the middle, understood that they now had to make a choice. Either they kept Anita calm and allowed treatment to continue while investigating in secret, or they confronted the hospital openly and began a public war. But going public meant the enemy would strike back, and if Anita really was ill, that counterattack could kill her faster. Remaining silent meant the enemy would have more time to erase evidence, strengthen the network, and perhaps continue manipulating events until Anita truly became a cancer patient through side effects, collapse, or infection. It was the perfect trap. The more the victim resisted, the easier it would be to describe her as unstable, paranoid, mentally affected by treatment. Anita, once a symbol of power, was in danger of being reduced to a woman branded as out of control. And that may have been the goal from the very beginning. There was no need to kill Anita outright if the world could simply be made to believe that Anita herself was no longer credible. Deep down, Anita's most terrifying reaction was not her anger but the dark clarity that came with her resolve. If this was a game, then she would play it to the end, and she would not let the other side walk away untouched. She began to see every relationship around her as a map of interests, every embrace as a test, every word of comfort as a measure of loyalty. That made her lonelier, but it also made her dangerous. A woman driven into a corner no longer fears losing her image. Once a person feels they have nothing left to lose, they can become capable of the cruelest things in order to reclaim power over their own life. Anita might be ready to tear the hospital apart through lawsuits and media exposure, but she might also choose the quieter path, hunting the mastermind the way one hunts an animal, waiting for the right moment to make it show itself. Vernon wanted to stop her from destroying herself, yet he also wanted justice with a desperation that tore at him almost as much as Anita's suffering. Ashley stood between morality and reality, between the need to save Anita and the fear that saving her might unleash an even greater catastrophe. And then, just as they began piecing everything together to verify the truth, one small sign appeared, but it was enough to make all of them go cold. Part of the medical record vanished from the system, as if someone had just realized Monica had started digging in the right place and immediately moved to clean the scene. In that instant, Anita understood that their suspicion was no longer just a theory. If nothing was wrong, why erase anything? If there was no conspiracy, why panic? No one needed to say the answer aloud. It hit Anita like a blow to the chest. Someone had truly pushed her into a living hell. And now, as Anita turned and stared directly back into that hell, it was staring right back at her.